Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Pete. I'm blessed to be joined by Dixie Dillon Lane, American historian, homeschooling parent who lives in rural Virginia. She holds a doctorate in history from the University of Notre Dame and serves as associate editor of Hearth Field. Dixie, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Thank you for having me. Very well. How are you?
Very well, thank you. I want to begin by very honestly sharing your sentiment. I never thought, as I was in my young adulthood, long before I got married, that I would one day be a proponent of homeschooling, and yet here we are. So I want to give you the space to share your story, and then I want to ask, what happened to us?
Yes, I think you and I are alike, and like many Americans today, in that we did not anticipate homeschooling our children. I think when I was growing up, at least, that was something that sometimes happened, but was in no way a norm, like going to public school or going to Catholic school. So I grew up in California. I went to public school. And later on in my life, when I went to graduate school, I started studying the history of homeschooling because I became aware that the movement was really growing. And graduate school takes quite a long time, of course. So while I was doing this, I also got married. I started having children. And much sort of to our surprise, my husband and I decided to homeschool. So it's been a wonderful journey for me to be studying homeschooling and homeschooling myself. And has really, I hope, helped me to understand what homeschooling today at something around 6.5% of American children is really all about in America.
Why? Okay, so I want to preface my question by just establishing a few things. As citizens of the United States, we understand that a big part of liberty is the right of parents to raise an informed children into an informed citizenry, however they see fit. It's an inherent part of liberty. But then we expand that into the Christian and Catholic call, and we realize that, no, it is part of the vocation of parenthood. So why is homeschooling so controversial?
Well, I think it's because, children are so important to everyone. And you're absolutely right, both in law in many ways and, of course, in our Catholic understanding of humanity. Parents are the primary protectors and educators of their children. But, of course, children grow up to be adults, so education is a public good as well as a private one. And I think people understood for a long time that even though it was a public good, it was something that parents had a lot of rights over. But in the 20th century, we began to lose that understanding. And so I think when people today think of homeschooling as controversial, a lot of the time it's because they're operating on this idea that school is the only way you can get an education and it's the only way you can become socialized. But that's actually a pretty new idea. Mm-hmm. That's an idea from 75 or 100 years ago, not from, all of time.
It's also, we know not just from data, but from the application of reason, a very unsound idea. I invite you to comment as to why that is.
Yes. So as an American historian, if I'm looking at American history, when we think about stories from our past that we might have read, like the Little House books or things like that, we know that school was important. It was something that people valued, and it still is today. I'm very grateful for good schools. But it's just not a panacea. It's also always been the case that there have been many other ways of learning. So when we think about education in America as being equal to school, and especially to public school, and that being the only way to keep our country safe, not only is that not really upheld by the performance of public schools today, but it also doesn't really make sense in terms of what education is and what families are and what's needed for the good of our country. We really need to have, in my opinion, a lot of different options.
I want to invite your thoughts on the other reality that we misunderstand what healthy socialization ought to look like. There's never going to be another avenue where our children are exposed to only members of their own age group under very set parameters of everyone learning the exact same thing the exact same way the moment they leave school. And so there's an element of an artificiality to it that we need to consider when we talk about socialization as well.
I think you're absolutely right. There's the question of what does a socialized person look like?
Mm-hmm.
And also, when we're talking about someone being socialized, they're always being socialized into a particular community and a particular context. And that's true for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
That's true for public school kids. So, I think when people say that they worry about socialization for homeschool kids, I think often they mean they're worried that homeschool kids are not going to be like kids who are going to school and who are socialized mainly in their peer group. But again, that's not the kind of socialization we've had over the years in our country or in human history either. It's very common and very healthy for people to be socialized in families, in mixed age groups, in churches. And we actually know from data from the past 15 years that homeschoolers are not, by and large, on average, isolationists. They are part of their public communities. Mm-hmm. So they go to libraries, they go to plays, they go to concerts. So it's simply not true that on average, homeschool kids aren't socialized. They're just not being socialized the same way. As a friend of mine says, there are weird kids everywhere. School doesn't fix that.
So if you may pardon me playing on that humor, choose your weird.
Yes, yes, exactly. And, I was just talking with someone the other day, when we think about the things that are really important about living adult life, like being able to speak respectfully with different kinds of people and practicing virtue and having skills like being able to call the doctor and set up your own appointment. All parents, all attentive parents need to be helping their children gain those skills, whether they're in school or not in school. Those are not necessarily school-based skills by and large.
The other issue I want to ask you to also speak to is the fact that the way we do school right now is formed in a particular model, and it takes children significantly away from their parents. Those are very precious years of formation that children just are away from their parents.
Yes, so as you were kind enough to mention my book, Skipping School, this is one of the main arguments of my book, is that homeschooling numbers really increased because parents lost influence. And there's a difference between control and influence, right? Obviously, if you're sending your child to a school, you have to give up a little bit of control. You need to let the teacher teach them, mm-hmm. right? But you have to retain influence. So even in the past 25 years, parental influence has been lost in schools to a degree that schools are able to do things in loco parentis in ways that we really would not have seen before. And parents have less and less access and ability to solve problems. And indeed, teachers themselves have less ability to solve problems on a local level because everything is so bureaucratic and policy-driven.
I want to make sure I mention your book, because everything about this conversation is coming from the result of your beautiful book. So Dixie Dillon Lane, A History of American Homeschooling and How It Went Mainstream. The real title of the book is Skipping School. One of the things that you've highlighted, which, again, very near and dear to my heart, everything you've written, one of the things you've highlighted, as I just brought up, is that, so I used to teach high school. I noticed that from the day the student signs the high school contract until the day they graduate high school, nothing else will take up their life, both in terms of social, academic, spiritual formation, all of the categories, other than that school. And that includes parents. I saw my students regularly have days that started at 6:30 a.m. and would end sometimes closer to 10, 11 p.m. if they had other activities that went on. And they'd sometimes go a whole week never having real substantial interaction with their parents. You highlight this reality. I want to invite you to speak to it and the harms that can do for children.
Sure. I mean, I think that
I'm so sorry. We're going to have to take a break. I'm talking with Dixie Dillon Lane. She's the author of Skipping School, A History of American Homeschooling and How It Went Mainstream. We're going to continue on the other side of the break. This is an important conversation, and like Dixie mentions, unfortunately controversial, and yet this is an area that's growing in interest in the United States and in the Christian church in the United States. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter, talking with Dixie Dillon Lane, author of Skipping School, A History of American Homeschooling and How It Went Mainstream. Dixie, I left you with a large question before the break. Let's pick up where we left off.
Sure. We were discussing the hardships that come from a school system where children sometimes spend many, many, many hours a day at school and maybe have less than enough time with their families. And I don't want to be too hard on schools just as a model, because of course there are wonderful schools that serve their students well as including Catholic schools. But it's true that many schools are set up in ways that can work against the family rather than with the family. And as working hours get longer, school hours also get longer, and kids are really in a very particular peer environment. Whereas in the homeschooling community, there's lots of opportunity, in some ways actually, to encounter a lot of people who are different from you in other ways. So you're not just always in the same environment away from your family with a small peer group in a certain cultural context. So I think that one of the real blessings of homeschooling, one of the pull factors that bring people into it, is actually the fact that, which shouldn't surprise us, but it seems like it does surprise people sometimes, parents like to be with their children, and they want to be with their children. And, they get to be with siblings, too, and out in the community doing some wonderful things. So that is definitely an advantage of homeschooling, is being with the family more.
And conversely, children like being with their parents, and it's actually good for them to be spending all those precious formative years and days with their parents.
Yes, it is. In many cases it is. And I also think, we know the importance of childhood independence. So this isn't to say that children should never do anything outside of the watchful eye of their parents. But what I've actually found in my own experience of homeschooling is, with my children at home, my husband and I have a lot more time and ability to support them in the kind of projects that kids used to do before school hours were so long. So to help our kids learn how to make their own purchases at a store, to help our kids figure out how to go ask a neighbor if they can mow their lawn, selling cookies door to door, that kind of wonderful childhood experience that can be taken away if all the hours are spent at school. So it also can support healthy childhood independence.
Can we also, therefore, talk about the great benefit that it brings children in terms of moral formation, virtuous formation? You highlighted in your book, in the schooling system, the traditional schooling system, we expect our children to be morally formed by their peers who have themselves never figured out what moral virtue ought to look like. And so should we be surprised when it very often backfires?
Yes, I think it's very challenging, because we do, of course, want our children to be critical thinkers, and especially as they get older, to be able to engage with people who are different from them and understand the humanity of all people. One thing that homeschooling allows is for you to really focus in and hone in on that kind of foundation before children are exposed to really destabilizing ideas in areas like sexuality and in faith issues. Now, you may not want your kindergartner going through sex ed in the California public schools, and that's different from, your 16-year-old needing to learn about some of the beliefs that are out there and how to engage with people who have different beliefs. So homeschooling really provides the opportunity to give children that foundation that then supports them when they start to encounter these things that at 5 or 6 or 7 years old, they really can't even understand. So that is definitely another benefit, because schools have always been diverse, and a lot of diversity is a very good thing. But we as a culture no longer share standards about what children should not be exposed to, like we may have 50 or 75 years ago. And when we did share those standards, it was easier for us to be able to educate our children together, even at a young age.
Therefore, just to very honestly shed light on this issue, the social structures and the institutional infrastructures that used to support what we can rightly consider I use this term carefully, socially conservative, but really what I mean is natural law and Judeo-Christian values and principles. Those existed at a societal level, and so we could trust institutions to, by and large, help us form our children, but those same safeguards no longer exist.
Yes, and schools were never perfect, and we don't want to be too starry-eyed about it. And there were some great injustices, but the truth is that there were social standards that allowed for children to be out in the public more unsupervised. That allowed for children to have a more predictable encounter with adults and peers, in their local culture, and that's really been dismantled in a lot of ways.
Can we also address the reality that institutionally there is no one size, you highlight this in your book, there is no one size fits all for every single student. And so in some ways we could academically and formatively be doing individual children an injustice in not working with their strengths and their weaknesses.
Yes, and I think one of the sad things that has happened in most public school systems is because decisions are no longer made in the classroom by the teacher and the parents. They're more often made at least at the district level, but often at a state or national level. Some of the things that were different about particular children or particular issues that came up, they used to be able to be handled locally and personally between teachers and parents. You really can't do that anymore. The teacher's hands, even if they're a teacher that is very interested in helping your child, their hands are often tied by policies. So in my research, I talked to many homeschoolers who began homeschooling because there was some issue within the school and they were unable to have any effect on it. So a child who is reading slowly, a child who is reading quickly, a child who's being bullied, the school would say there's nothing that can be done. And that's because decisions are not being made by the people who are local and know your child. And so that makes it much harder to participate in this together, I think, effectively and make sure that children get what they need.
We can also acknowledge that there is a legitimate concern about high-level donors and private schools and how that influences and shapes, societal currents within the private schools and sometimes even disciplinary decisions.
Yes, there are so many different kinds of private schools, and some of them function very much with the same kind of curricula, the same kind of politics, the same kind of pedagogical approach as public schools, just at a higher level and in a more expensive way, in a more exclusive social kind of way. And some of them, are animated by excitement about a particular way of teaching, like classical education or Montessori or Waldorf schools. But yes, I think one of the stories of Catholic homeschooling has been that just because a school is Catholic, no longer means that, it's hard to understand what that means. And so a lot of people whose local Catholic schools are not faithful schools or are just using the Common Core curriculum, for example, or the same sex ed as the public schools, they're no longer places that they feel they can send their children. There's so much, just because a school is public or private or even a homeschool doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be what you think it's going to be. There's so many factors at play in education.
Can we also acknowledge that even for schools that are supposedly Catholic in spirituality, having particular education systems that, when it comes to things like the faith and spirituality, they almost inadvertently revert to the lowest common denominator that tends to not be very helpful for the individual faith formation?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. I mean, obviously we have, I don't know if crisis is the right word and that it's been ongoing, but we have a lot of difficulty with drawing youth toward Christ and keeping youth in the practice of their faith. And I don't know what the solution is for schools, but I think that students who are faithful, who already have a foundation of faith, who enter schools like you're describing, sometimes have a very difficult time because they feel that it's a very empty presentation of it and that they can see that it's not reaching their peers, so it can be very demoralizing.
Now, in all of this, as we're rounding off this segment, you've presented a robust presentation for the case for homeschooling. I want to give you the space here to just speak directly to our listeners about considering it and what steps they can possibly take to discern applying homeschooling to their life if they have obstacles.
Sure, and let me say that homeschooling itself isn't a virtue, it's a practice. So you don't have to homeschool. There are other options, but many of us will find ourselves discerning that this is something that we want to do, and maybe we even feel called to. So let me just say to anyone who is feeling that, please allow me to encourage you. There is so much support available. There are so many resources and so many different ways to homeschool, and you can be very pragmatic about it. You can start, if you like. My friends and I have a Substack called The Bad Moms Homeschool that is full of practical advice, but you can get that anywhere. Don't start off trying to recreate what you remember from school, but just get some basics down and try to enjoy your children. This is a precious time. And if you need help, get help. Homeschooling isn't something you have to do alone anymore. It's such a big part of society that it's no longer weird. Like you were saying, Marcus, you choose your weird, but it's something most people can do if they wish to do it and believe it's important for their families.
Dixie, I tremendously enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I enjoyed it too.
My guest has been Dixie Dillon Lane. She holds a PhD in history from the University of Notre Dame, and she's the author of this new book, Skipping School, A History of American Homeschooling and How It Went Mainstream. I want to greatly encourage us to get a copy of this and consider this, even if not for ourselves, for friends and family. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.